Thank you for joining us tonight. History made today when the Identity Preparatory Academy gained approval to open its doors. It will become the first Black-founded all-girls school in the state of Nebraska. After delaying conditional approval for the all-girls middle school in North Omaha yesterday, the Nebraska Board of Education voted 8-0 to approve it today. Some board members had concerns over language used to describe school curriculum they perceived to be anti-American. Nebraska State Senator Terrell McKinney told the board the academy met all state requirements and there was nothing anti-American about its teachings.
The conversation about the abolitionist language, people weaponize words to fit their own narrative about how they feel about things like this. And that's what's disappointing, is that individuals on the board, I assume, feel some type of way about young Black girls being educated by Black women in our community. And because they are telling them about their true history and not a fabricated history and just a true understanding of self, it receives pushback.
Today's special meeting was held virtually and in person. More than a dozen people spoke in favor of the academy. The first day of school is set for August 19th.